January 19th, 1939, Berlin, Wilhelmstrasse. A closed door, a typed decree, and a silence that outlasted signatures. Hjalmar Schacht, once the alchemist of German stabilization and the architect of its rearmament finance, is dismissed as president of the Reichsbank. Officially, it is gratitude and a handshake. In practice, it is the end of a bargain. The Reich will have more guns, the books will balance later. The instrument that made this possible never wore a uniform. It didn't roll on tracks or whistle from a factory roof. It was a piece of paper that pretended to be a bill of exchange, issued by a company that didn't make anything, and it paid for the army that would unmake a continent. They called it a MEFO bill. A company with no products and infinite purchases. Spring 1934, Berlin. In a small suite with a forgettable name, Metallurgical Forschungsgesellschaft, MBH, MEFO, was registered as a limited liability firm. It had 1 million Reichsmarks of equity and no factories, no warehouses, no staff in overalls. MEFO existed to sign promissory notes on demand. Those notes, MEFO bills, were technically 6 months' bills of exchange. In reality, they were a rolling line of credit for Hitler's armaments drive, extendable by routine 90-day prolongations and sweetened with a 4% coupon to make them attractive to suppliers. Banks were told to treat them as good as cash, discountable at will, and, crucially, rediscountable at the Reichsbank near maturity. A ghost company became the tap that filled Germany's arms orders off the government's visible balance sheet. By 1938, roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks of MEFO bills were outstanding, a hidden second budget shadowing the stock of government debt.
The Wizard and the Trap. Hjalmar Schacht returned to the Reichsbank in 1933 with a reputation for magic. The technocrat who slew hyperinflation, the negotiator who bullied reparations. MEFO was his most audacious trick, credit creation without saying debt. He had a model in his pocket, earlier IRFA bills for public works, now scaled for national rearmament. Inside the bank, lawyers bristled that the device twisted the Reichsbank Act. Economists warned that the bill would come due. The president pressed on. Financing would be found, the letter would bend, the future would pay. For a time, the machine hummed. Armament firms invoiced the government, received MEFO bills, and either held them for interest or rediscounted them into cash to buy steel, coal, machine tools, labor. The Reichsbank absorbed the paper near maturity, rolling the liability forward as long as necessary. The device promised temporariness. The war economy made it permanent. Balance sheet reconstructions tell the story plainly. Against the original plan, MEFO paper piled up on the Reichsbank's books and stayed there, funded and refunded until German state structures collapsed in 1945. What the bills bought. From Solingen to the Ruhr, from Augsburg to Kiel, MEFO bills moved where material moved. The Army's orders multiplied: rifles, optics, trucks. The Luftwaffe's, airframes, engines, high-octane fuel. The Kriegsmarines, turbines, steel plate, precision gear. Firms that might have balked at slow government payment learned a new reflex: accept MEFO, discount MEFO, produce more. 4% interest compensated for the wait. The Reichsbank's backstop killed doubts. The point was not cheapness, but speed, rapid mobilization while keeping the official deficit deceptively modest. Outside observers noticed the recovery, not its plumbing. Industrial output surged, unemployment plunged. Some called it a miracle. Economic historians, more exacting, pointed to its contradictions. A regime consuming future revenue to buy present power. A credit engine that required ever tighter controls on imports, prices, and labor to avoid breaking its own exchange rate constraints. MEFO bought time. Policy spent it.
The illusion of non-inflation. Where is the inflation, skeptics asked.
The answer lived in deferred realization. MEFO goals did not flood grocers' tills. They changed suppliers and banks to the Reich. So long as bills rolled over, extensions upon extensions, and production flowed into armaments rather than civilian goods, headline prices could be contained by controls and rationing. The fuse would burn only when the bills matured en masse, or when wartime shortages forced the reckoning. Even by 1938, the 12 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO paper were a silent second budget, their redemption a cliff edge officials tiptoed around. Hidden is not harmless. The liability had been created. The bill would fall due. Inside the Reichsbank, the legal soul protested. Senior counsel judged MEFO incompatible with the statute. Others defended it as a state necessity. The bank of law became the bank of regime survival. The break with Göring and the dismissal. By late 1938, MEFO had done what it was built to do, bridge the rearmament surge. But the bridge was sagging. Göring's 4-year plan demanded more guns, more synthetics, more autarky than finance could safely carry. Schacht urged braking, less deficit, more orthodoxy. Göring wanted throttle. Hitler chose Göring. On January 19, 1939, Schacht was dismissed as Reichsbank president. The engine he designed would run without its engineer.
How it worked in practice, and why it worked at all. Strip away the acronyms, and the operation is brutally simple. The state places an armaments order. The supplier is paid with a MEFO bill, a trade bill promising cash in 6 months. The supplier discounts the bill at a bank to obtain cash now. As maturity nears, the bank rediscounts the bill at the Reichsbank. Settlement is rolled, often for years. Because MEFO is private, the state's headline deficit looks smaller. The Reichsbank's formal lending limits are not technically breached. Why it worked? Credible state demand plus a central bank put. Why it lasted? Coercion and control, of banks compelled to play along, of firms reliant on state orders, of a public insulated from obvious inflation by rationing and suppressed consumption. Why it broke? Because scale and war always call the question. Bills mature, imports must be paid, resources run out. A network of paper behind the hardware of war. Think of the MEFO scheme as an invisible assembly line feeding the visible one. In the same way a good radio nets armored crews into a single organism, MEFO netted factories and banks into a single balance sheet. The economy functioned like a clearinghouse. Inputs flowed to armaments, paper promises flowed back. Whether one chooses the language of Keynesian boost or administrative credit state, the mechanics were unmistakable. The regime built a command credit architecture in which MEFO was the grammar. And the grammar spread. Bilateral clearing with occupied Europe later mirrored the logic. Germany paid with blocked accounts and forced exchange rates, extracting goods today for settlement someday, often never. MEFO taught the method, empire scaled it.
The reckoning deferred. By 1939, some MEFO paper had been converted into long-term bonds. Much of it sat at the Reichsbank, rolled and re-rolled, a growing claim on the state's future tax base. Contemporary testimony and modern balance sheet studies converge. The operation's endgame was monetization, funding by the central bank that could not end until the state itself ended. In May 1945, it did. The ghost currency outlived the regime only by days. Its value evaporated with it. MEFO was always what it pretended not to be: state debt. Lesson learned, then forgotten, then learned again. What MEFO proved is not that money grows on trees, but that states can mobilize resources at speed when they dominate balance sheets, of banks, of firms, of the central bank itself. It also proved that balance sheet truth delayed is not truth denied. Hidden liabilities return as inflation, as default, or as regime risk. After 1945, the architects of a new monetary order tried to bind sovereigns to transparency and limits. Germany's post-war central bank tradition insisted on law and restraint, in part because its predecessor had explored every workaround. The tanks and planes of 1939 were tangible. Their financing was vapor made solid by decree and fear. MEFO bills bought the years in which Hitler rearmed. The reckoning came later, as it always does, payable in a currency no banker can discount: blood and ruin.